Hi, everyone, again. Disclaimers. To the best of my recollection, I have no conflicts. I haven't been arrested yet. I have no family members or friends on death row. Well, it's mostly true, at least. All right. The outline of the talk today is, first we're going to narrow in on what we're going to talk about, the background, the legal landscape, the issues, arguments, and counter-arguments, and then a summary. So what is the focus of the discussion? We have to really be careful to distinguish this because this issue brings up a lot of debate, and often people that are arguing against each other are talking about different aspects. What I'm going to be talking about today is, should condemned prisoners, that is, those that are on death row, be allowed, of their own volition, to donate their organs upon death? I'm not talking about should all prisoners be allowed. I'm not talking about should condemned prisoners be allowed to donate their non-essential organs while they're alive, in other words, living related. And I'm not talking about whether we can harvest the organs from them without their permission. Those are all very separate issues that if you want during the discussion afterwards, we can certainly bring that up. But I want to focus in particular about that first one. All right, background. You may have seen a movie about this story. In 2001, so about 16 years ago, a career criminal named Christian Longo murdered his wife and 3 children. He strangled his wife and his 2-year-old daughter, Madison, put them in suitcases and threw them into the river. He stuffed his 3-year-old daughter, Sadie, and his 4-year-old son, Zachary, alive into their pillowcases, weighed them down with rocks, and threw them into the body of water. The crime was finally discovered when Zachary's body emerged from the water, but Longo was well gone. 2 years later, Longo was found living with his girlfriend in Mexico. I guess they need a wall as well, huh? He had stolen the identity of a New York Times reporter, Michael Finkel, and you may have seen the movie about it. It's called True Story. He was arrested, returned to Oregon, put on trial, and was found guilty of 4 counts of murder and sentenced to death. He remains to this day on death row. Several years back, in 2011, he wrote a letter that was published on the op-ed page of the New York Times. He had reportedly, remorsefully, decided that he would find some worth in his life. So he started an effort to try to get prisoners to be allowed, especially those on death row, to be able to donate organs. In his letter, I spend 22 hours a day locked in a 6-foot by 8-foot box on Oregon's death row. There is no way to atone for my crimes, but I believe that a profound benefit to society can come from my circumstances. I have asked to end my remaining appeals and then donate my organs after my execution to those who need them, but my request has been rejected by the prison authorities. There is no law barring inmates condemned to death in the United States from donating their organs, but I haven't found any prisons that allow it. The main explanation is that Oregon and most other states use a sequence of 3 drugs for lethal injections that damage the organs. But Ohio and Washington use a larger dose of just one drug, the barbiturate, and it doesn't destroy the organs. If states would switch to a 1-drug regimen, inmates' organs could be saved. If I donated all my organs today, I could clear nearly 1% of my state's organ waiting list. I am 37 years old, healthy. Throwing my organs away after I am executed is nothing but a waste. So that sort of sets the stage. His letter really nicely puts together the issues that have been raised. And some of the issues are a little bit surprising, and we'll discuss a little bit of it. So for background, what is the legal landscape? What do we know from our historical legal past about what can and cannot be done? So there are 2 statutes that govern organ donation in the United States, and they've been around for a long time. NOTA, the National Organ Transplantation Act, is a federal statute that authorizes the creation of an organ procurement agency and prohibits payment for organs. The UAGA, Revised Uniform Anatomical Gift Act, has been approved by 46 states and DC and provides that any adults may commit to be an organ donor. Neither statute prohibits organ donation by inmates, although that specific issue wasn't brought up either. UNOS, the OPO that runs organ transplantation in the United States, is a private nonprofit organization. Its ethics committee deliberated over this topic of condemned prisoners donating. And they came up with an announcement that it opposes any statute that supports organ donation by condemned prisoners until all ethical concerns are addressed. People who are fighting against allowing the prisoners to donate their organs bring this up as validation, but it's not really. What they did is left the door open. They said, listen, we don't think we know enough about this process right now to recommend it. And if we do at some point in time, then we'll basically consider it. Insofar as the donation of organs by inmates after they're dead, it isn't expressly prohibited, but almost every district has prevented it from occurring. So by law, prisoners can donate their organs after they're dead. But none of the prison systems have allowed it. We do have a history of allowing donations from prisoners for other aspects of donation. Blood donation. Here, as often as occurs with sometimes paying derelicts off the street, they get paid for their blood. The way they get paid, though, is not in money, it's in time. They get a certain number of days off their sentence. I think it's 10 or 20 days every time they donate, and they're limited to the number of donations they can do in a year. My point in making this, or including this information, is not to say that that is right or wrong. It's just that it's not as if prisoners haven't been able to donate parts of their body or some of their fluids. Living organ donation has been approved for prisoners as well, and is done on a selective basis, with the caveats that it has to be a relative and the family has to pay for it. The prison system isn't going to be responsible for it. Unlike sex change operation, right? All right. Other states, Texas allows only general population inmates to serve as living-related donors as long as it is a close relative and the family bears the cost, just like the federal. South Carolina allows living-related donation if the donation is not considered a security threat. So here they're dealing with the fact that this prisoner is going to have to go to a hospital. Let's say they're donating an organ. What is our concern about whether this guy is going to try to escape? To date, some living donations have occurred from prisoners. Some have come close but have been disqualified for one reason or another, and some have been turned down because of policy by their state prison boards. A famous death row case occurred in Florida with a guy by the name of Calvin Campbell who wanted to donate his kidney to an ailing youth. He was denied. He actually brought it to an appellate court on constitutional grounds, that it was his constitutional right to donate his organs. The court denied his request, saying if he were free, the appellant would have the right to donate one of his kidneys to whomever he desired. He has no right to the relief he seeks, however, in consequence of his incarceration. And the same thing holds true for other states. Well, what are the controversial issues? Some have already been brought up. Epidemiologically, it's been brought up that our need is so great for additional organs and the number of prisoners so few that it really is not going to have much impact. So the question is, if we were to promote organ donation by those on death row, what would be that impact? And that would be a reflection of what the demand would be and what the supply would be. As far as demand is concerned, and there are obviously a lot of detailed slides about organ transplantation and how we're not meeting the needs. But this really hones it down. The average number of people who die waiting for an organ transplant in the United States yearly is about 11,000 people. So that on a daily basis, 30 people die every day waiting. That's the equivalent of 22 jumbo jets crashing every year. Is that you, Joe? Or you escaped that fate, right? As far as supply is concerned, would using these organs not increase the donor pool? Well, it would. But executions are increasingly rare in this country. Here's a chart of the number of people that have been sentenced to death by year from 1998 to 2016. Back in 1998, it was almost 300 people. Now we're down to about 30 annually. That's sentencing. These are the number of executions that have also been parallel. You can see in 2017, 13 people have been executed. We're only part through the year. Last year was 20. Would using these organs not increase the donor pool? Yes. So we've already said that we have only a few people that are executed. And of those, most of them would not be candidates, is the argument. You know, one of the criteria for picking a donor is patient age. And here we go for the last 3 years. Of those who are in prison on death row, on average, about 35 of them are less than 70, but only 22 are less than 50 in 2014. The most recent year is even less. In 2016, there were 19 patients less than 70, but about half of them less than 50. So you see the numbers are dwindling now. Quality is also a concern. HIV, hepatitis is more prevalent in prisons. Some come to prison with the disease, others get it while in prison. Here is a table of HIV in prisons, and of the 2.2 million people in jail in the United States, about 1.5% are either HIV positive or have AIDS, which is 4 times what the general population is. Honestly, when I saw this, I thought it was low. I was surprised. With that low number, and with screening of HIV, I don't see this as much of a concern, but certainly in the public perception, it might be. Finally, current methods of execution will prohibit most vital organs from being adequate. In terms of the method of execution, we've had a variety that have been used over the years. Electrocutions, the last one was in 2013. Firing squad, as recently as 2010. Gas chamber hasn't been used in over 20 years. Hanging in over 25 years. And lethal ejection is by far the predominant mode of execution. And you may have seen this in the media in recent years, that there were issues with some of the medications that were being given, and some patients weren't adequate, I keep saying. Some prisoners weren't adequately sedated. But there's a 3-drug regimen, thiopentol, pancuronium, and KCL, one for sedation, one for paralysis, and one for stopping the heart. Some have moved to a high-dose sodium thiopental. So with this regimen, the patients are put to death, and obviously during that period of time, there's hypoxic ischemia, which is not unlike the model we use for death from cardiac disease, right? When we have patients that they haven't suffered brain death, but they're being removed from support for other reasons, and they die a cardiac death. They go through a similar, although somewhat more protracted, means of death. And ultimately, would using these organs not increase the pool? The issue is the geography. Most of these places are very isolated. And if you have to think in your mind, if somebody is on the table, getting put to death, what's the connection between that and getting to harvest their organ, and where? You can imagine what kind of delay there would be. With all these factors in consideration, the estimated net increase in donors in the United States would be less than 0.2%. So really pretty trivial. But the counter argument to that is, if you have one more organ, isn't that better than none? And, it's a life saved. Do we disallow donation from the condemned solely because, based on its probable epidemiological insignificance, it won't add much to the pool? I don't think so. There are logistical issues as well, which I just alluded to. I spoke about the way that these patients are put to death. Typically, they get the regimen. After the regimen is put in, they wait a period of 10 to 15 minutes and then assess whether the heart has stopped. And once the heart is stopped, they declare death. Importantly, just like with the DCD donors, no one can do anything to expedite the death. In the United States, by law, if anybody even expedites someone's death by a second, that's murder. The logistical issues I've mapped up here. For conventional organ harvest, we have a patient in the hospital who has had a brain death, brought to the operating room. The organs are preserved, you harvest, and you give cardioplegia and pneumoplegia, as well as plegia to the rest of the organs, and cold preserve them. Or we put them on the warm beating machine, right? For DCD harvest, it's a little bit more cumbersome. And I know Dr. Bailey is very familiar with this from the early days with using, when they were investigating circulatory death hearts, whether they could be used for organ donation in the United States. So in DCD, there's a circulatory death in the OR, and you have a mandatory waiting period. And you're not allowed to intervene before that period has occurred. And in addition, the doctor who harvests cannot be part of the team that determines the death. It's all separated. And then after the confirmation of death, you're all there, you're scrubbed, you go in and you remove the organ. For executions, imagine how much longer that's going to take. You have just like the DCD model, but after the patient's died, you now have to transport them quickly to a hospital that can perform a donation. And that really won't work. Potential solution is, if you're going to pursue that route, is actually moving the prisoner to the hospital and have them get executed there, so to speak. Take them to the OR, give them injections, and as soon as the injections have caused death, and then harvest the organs. The problem is, if the public finds out about this, the hospital may not be too happy. I don't know a single hospital that would be comfortable with doing this. It also poses ethical conflicts for physicians. Is exactly when does the execution stop and the harvesting begin? Those are not easy questions to answer. How about consent? The backdrop here is China, and I don't know how much you've heard about it, but China has a real big issue that is not so much an issue for the Chinese, apparently, but for the rest of the globe. There are 5,000 executions annually in China. Organs are harvested from suitable prisoners without consent. Prisoners selected for donation are executed by a temporal gunshot wound, and then patients are immediately declared dead without an examination and brought to the hospital for organ harvest without ever a confirmation of any sort of death. That's the way it's done. Obviously, in our country, that gives a lot of people pause, and there's great concern. Informed consent, which we're going to talk a little bit about on Saturday, but for now, it's very important that the inmate understand the procedure, and he must give his consent without any coercion. Death row prisoners have lost most of their rights. They're wards of the state, meaning, in the end, consent decisions are done by the state, not by the prisoner. The state holds the legal authority, and state prison boards have used their authority to deny organ donation, and that's why it hasn't been happening, although it's legal to do so. As far as the ability of the prisoner himself to make a mistake, yes, they're under extreme stress by being in prison. That's no surprise. But is there coercion? A lot of people have brought this up as an issue. And for the most part, if it's patients who are donating their organ after they're going to be dead, there's very little coercion involved. And certainly protections can be put in place. Where the ethical dilemmas come up are patients who are trying to trade their organs for a lesser sentence while they're alive. For instance, wanting to donate a kidney if they can get a couple of years off their sentence, or if they can be removed from death row and go to life imprisonment. And you can see where that can be very fuzzy. But for the patients that are on death row, who are unequivocally, after all their requests have been denied, they're going to die, these patients are bringing it up on their own. If anything, the prison is stopping them from doing what they want to do. The American Society of Transplant Surgeons finds taking from death row prisoners unacceptable, and it's a violation of free and willing organ donation. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. It's not as if someone's holding a gun to their head and saying, you donate. And in fact, most prisons don't want them to. This is really a spurious argument. There really is not coercion involved, and if anything, their rights are being denied. If anything, they're being coerced not to donate. Another argument with coercion is that just being in prison alone makes them incapable of consent. That they're under just a native basal degree of coercion. Well, yes, they have to go to their cell when they're supposed to. They have to show up for meals when they're supposed to. They can't beat the hell up out of their roommates. But to be sufficiently coerced that it affects their decision about whether they want to donate an organ, that really is a far stretch. There is concern about a stigma that potential recipients won't want organs for prisoners. I don't believe that either. I think if you're desperate enough and you're not getting an organ, that you'll take an organ from anybody if your choice is dying within weeks. We do screen the donors, and in fact, one might argue that the prisoners get the best screening. Why? Because we're not trying to make them screen for a donation within days. This can be years in the making, okay? Secondly, death row, vast majority of them are on isolation. So, diseases don't get propagated as easily as they would in the general population, okay? So think about those things. The judicial system. Well, the objection has been raised. If prisoners can donate organs, maybe it'll affect the way the judge and jury behave and decide on whether to give them the death penalty. That's got to be a big stretch, too. I don't think anybody on the judge or the jury is going to be thinking about the patient's potential for being an organ donor when deciding what their sentence is. Punishment. So, punishment in prisons has a variety of theories as to why we do it. And you're all relatively familiar with these, okay? The most important ones that arguments have been raised about is whether there is some interference with the retribution element or the deterrence element or the rehab element of putting them in prison. Remember, these guys are on death row. In terms of retribution, the concern is that they're going to become a Christ-like figure, sentenced to death and being saviors at the last minute by donating their organs. So-called the killer as hero. I don't believe that as much. The one concern in this area that I do have is the families. And I think if we go down this route, the families of the victims have to be involved in that decision. Because if you're stealing from anybody, you're stealing from that family. So let's talk about Christian, the guy who killed his whole family. Let's say 0, is that my IQ? So the parents of his wife are probably looking forward to the day when he is executed. And if all of a sudden he can donate his organs, that may or may not be displeasing to them. But you have to think about that. In terms of deterrence, deterrence is punishment imposed for deterring others from committing the crime. So, well, there's two. There's general and specific deterrence. One is to deter the person himself from ever doing it again. You're on death row, that's already taken care of. So this is general deterrence, deterrence to the other population. And if you're able to donate your organs, might it lessen the deterrence effect of being put to death? I don't think so. I don't see any way that that's valid. But again, these are all arguments that are being raised. Rehabilitation. Question is there a purpose for rehabilitating someone on death row? Well, to some effect, he is now making responsible decisions, altruistic decisions, that for whatever time he has left on earth, that may be a positive. In terms of making a decision about this and coming to a place in your own mind, you want to balance about how we think ethically of matters. And there's usually two schools of thought. One is a utilitarian, where we say, what's the greatest good for the greatest many? One might think if a prisoner can donate his organs after death, we would fulfill it on those grounds. Kantian ethics says, treat each person as an end in himself, never solely as a means. This is a spin-off of the golden rule, but not quite. What it's saying is you can use people for other reasons, but you have to treat that person as an end in himself. Meaning, you can execute this prisoner to use his organs for somebody else, as long as you're maintaining respect for his autonomy, which you have. In news polls, in 2011, MSNBC surveyed 86,000. 77% people said yes, that they should be allowed to donate their organs. So in summary, the argument regarding whether condemned prisoners should be allowed to donate organs has to be very specific and shouldn't be conflated with the related issues that I mentioned at the beginning. There is ample legal precedent of allowing a prisoner to make a decision about donation. Most ethical concerns regarding consent, autonomy, punishment do not appear to be prohibitive if they are valid at all. In fact, it would appear that the more compelling ethical concern is that we're disallowing what they want to do. The most important impediment is if it were to become acceptable, how we would do it. The practical matters seem to be the more problematic aspect rather than the ethical. Thank you.